There's much to talk about here, so let's get to our panel right away. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Peter Bechtold. He served as the Director for Near East and North Africa Area Studies at the U.S. Foreign Service Institute. With us here in Washington is Kamran Bokhari. He's a specialist on the geopolitics of the Middle East with the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute. Remi Piet is a Senior Director with America's Market Intelligence. He's joining us from Miami, and here in the studio with us again is President of the Turkish Heritage Organization, Ali Cinar. Ali, why don't we start with you? Erdogan calling this a savage killing, dismissing any notion that perhaps these were rogue elements or it was a fistfight gone awry, saying, why were these 15 guys there who obviously knew how to do this sort of thing, and then asking the question, who gave the orders? Talk to me about his performance, and I guess if you were using basketball terminology, it's kind of a full court press on the Saudi government.
Actually, it was. His message was so clear that there should be a clear investigation, international investigation, and find the results of the investigation. President Erdogan also was asked 18 suspects, actually it wasn't 15, 18 suspects should be extradited and have the trial in Istanbul. So CIA director right now is in Turkey to finalize the investigation and bring back to United States. So President Erdogan, what he's trying to do, pressure Saudis and wants United States to act. Otherwise, it's not Turkey versus Saudi Arabia. Turkey is saying that this is an international crisis issue. All, including United States, should be involved and finalize the details of this political murder. You're
right, 15, I guess there was an advanced team, he pointed out too, 3 members who showed up earlier. Kamran, let me ask you about one of the points he made, which is obviously the Saudi Arabian consulate, that's Saudi Arabian territory. But he said it happened within the confines of Turkey. He wants them extradited. He wants the justice to be found there in Turkey. How is the Saudi government going to respond to this?
I doubt that the Saudis are going to agree to that. I mean, A, they need an extradition agreement. And even if they did have one, this is such a high-profile international situation where the entire leadership of Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud, has been shaken. I doubt that they're going to go and say, hey, here are the 18 guys and now leave us alone. It's not happening. And they know that the Turkish government is not doing this for some altruistic sense of justice. They're using this opportunity to weaken Saudi Arabia so that they can advance their own geopolitical interests. So we need to bear in mind that nobody is doing anything over here that is devoid of interest, hardcore geopolitical interests.
And we're looking at just a couple of week period, but as you pointed out to me yesterday when we were talking about this is hundreds and hundreds of years we're talking about, not just what's happening here, this back and forth between these two governments in a sense.
Yes, I mean, this Turkish government under President Erdogan seeks to gain the leadership of at least the Sunni part of the region, which is the majority. And Saudi Arabia is the only Arab state standing in their path. And so weakening the Saudi government, using this as an opportunity, is what we see going on over here. I mean, in geopolitics, morality exists, but in geopolitics, there are hardcore interests that we just can't ignore. And I mean, I don't mean to say that the Saudis don't have interests. They definitely, they've committed murder. And their interest is, how do we get beyond it? But the Turks are saying, we're not going to let you get beyond it without us extracting some benefit.
And getting beyond it, Remi, their assembly saying this is a test of raw Saudi power. But of course, it's also a test of the international community. How do they value, human rights, press freedoms, all of that? What are we seeing from Europe? I mean, we're hearing some very strong words from the German chancellor. Give us a sense of how the European community is responding to this.
I mean, obviously, this is really a high-level case, and Erdogan has been pushing for a United Nations investigation on this issue because trying to make a lot of noise about it and trying to actually bring it up to his own agenda in terms of geopolitics, as the previous commentator mentioned. The idea for him to have the case in Turkey is also to be able to control the agenda of that potential investigation. From the European perspective, there's this issue of potential normative values of making sure that freedom of the press or the capacity of different actors to express diverging opinion, even from GCC citizens, is something that the European countries will always stand for. But I think the most important element here is to look at what's happening inside the GCC, and especially as we were mentioning, Turkey always had this will of extending its influence to the GCC countries, and there's this tension between Saudi Arabia and their former colonizer, the Ottoman Empire. And also, if we look at the issue of Qatar, for the last 2 years, Qatar has been left and blockade into a situation of blockade by Saudi Arabia, and seek the support of Turkey that built a military base in Qatar to try to protect the small Emirates from Saudi Arabian influence and potential invasion down the road. So we're seeing here a situation where Turkey finally has in its hands a series of cards and possibilities to put Saudi Arabia on the grill and just reaffirm its influence over the Middle East, whether as a cooperation with Qatar or just frontally with Saudi Arabia.
And Peter, the United States, let's move to how the U.S. has responded. Of course, President Trump's changed his position several times. He had something to say today. Let's listen to what he had to say.
They had a very bad original concept. It was carried out poorly, and the cover-up was one of the worst in the history of cover-ups. It's very simple. Bad deal, should have never been thought of. Somebody really messed up, and they had the worst cover-up ever. And where it should have stopped is at the deal standpoint, when they thought about it, because whoever thought of that idea, I think, is in big trouble. And they should be in big trouble.
Worst cover-up in the history of cover-ups. Peter, your take on that?
Well, it certainly was a bad cover-up. President Trump, of course, likes to use extreme language. Everything is always the worst or the best. But it was definitely a very bad cover-up. President Trump is under pressure because both Republicans, including Republican leaders, have said this will not stand. And they're planning to introduce legislation in Congress. And all he can do right now is to sort of try to push his own role as far away as he can, because he's concerned about the elections in November. So sending Gina Haspel to Ankara in order to get more information is one more element following Mr. Pompeo's visit to Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And he said as soon as he has all the information, he's going to do something. And they're obviously trying to figure out what to do. And it's not going to be nothing, and it's also not going to be as much as many people want.
But Peter, does the U.S. need to do some soul searching? Because it seems like, it's easy to point the finger at Donald Trump, but it seems like administration after administration, Democrat and Republican alike, have spent a lot of time pointing out countries that have been not so great with human rights or not so great with press freedoms. But it seems like they've kind of given a pass to Saudi Arabia. Should that change? Will it change?
Well, this is very difficult to say. If one believes the comments that have come out of the Davos in the Desert Conference, as reported in the New York Times today, the business people are saying this is just a blip. Yes, it was a terrible thing, but we're going to get over it. Next week, we'll talk about a different subject. I doubt that it will go away in a week. But there is an attitude here that Saudi Arabia has been a major player in the Middle East for the last 40 years or so. It has provided petroleum whenever we wanted more. They would up the production. Your audience may not know, the panelists will know, but your audience may not know that Saudi Arabia is called a swing producer in the world. They can increase production, they can lower production. And that is basically their main source of pressure against the oil importing countries.
So Peter making the point, Kamran, if you're a business executive, you're doing deals in Saudi Arabia, you want it to be a blip. And I imagine there are some in the administration who are hoping it's going to be a blip. And then there are others who are probably saying, look, we've got to come down hard on this. And you're kind of seeing that dichotomy. I mean, you've got Mnuchin in Riyadh, and you've got Gina Haspel in Turkey. They're kind of sending conflicting signals. Your sense on whether or not it's going to be a blip? It doesn't seem like it's going away, although I'm sure the Saudis would like it to go away, and some of these people doing business with Saudi Arabia would like it to go away.
So there's no magic formula, where you go through certain steps, and this is history. It doesn't work that way. this is going to stick to the kingdom for a long time to come. And so, putting 18 people under arrest, firing intelligence chiefs is not going to cut it, because nobody believes the narrative that this was a quote-unquote rogue operation. If you're firing most of your intelligence leadership, how is that a rogue operation? That's sort of your mainstay of your intelligence service. So something else has to happen. And I suspect that we will see, beyond this atmospherics, and as the pressure continues to sustain itself, the Saudis, and they're feeling internal pressure as well from all those princes who were superseded to make MBS take the throne after his father. All those princes who've been treated badly by MBS, for them, this is an opportunity of a lifetime. They want to be able to reassert themselves, and they're not going to give it up. So there's pressure from inside, there's pressure from outside. I suspect that there'll probably be some form of political change, not dismissing MBS, because that's not happening, because that would completely undermine stability in the kingdom. But there may be an appointment of a deputy crown prince, a senior prince with much more experience, to show the world that, we're not just letting a youngster run amok over here.
Give him advice, some guidance.
Exactly, some guidance, some advice. And I suspect the king is telling his nephews that this is what you need to do. Maybe they'll set up an advisory council. I don't know, I'm speculating here, but something has to change. This can't continue as, if it was a blip, let's get over it and return to business as usual.
Erdogan, though, also has a delicate balancing act, because he's deferential towards the king, but he really wants to put the pressure on the crown prince. Is he handling it well?
I think he does, because he has a good relationship with the king. I mean, he indirectly mentioned about MBS, but overall, we see that President Erdogan is very careful what he was saying today. And as I said, President Erdogan needs support from United States. Otherwise, Turkey cannot handle alone. And I don't think that Turkey will fight against Saudi in this case. I mean, we should remember that this murder happened in Turkey, in Istanbul. Of course, Turkey will react and try to finalize who did it, who behind on this case. And 18 suspects. Now Saudis are saying that there will be legal charges, but where is the body? I mean, Saudis right now playing, they don't know what happened, where is the body? Nobody is saying anything from the Saudi side. So Saudi is trying to gain time on this, but President Erdogan is very clear. This is an international issue. This is not a Turkish problem. So we need to look broader, and not Turkey is taking advantage against Saudi. This is the biggest problem globally, and journalist was killed, and Saudis messed with the wrong newspaper.
Let's get a sense of what we're hearing from the kingdom today, because there's been a lot of comments coming out. The Saudi foreign minister, meeting with his Indonesian counterpart, spoke about the investigation into the death. Here's what he had to say.
I expressed the commitment of the custodian of the two holy mosques, King Salman bin Abdulaziz, and the commitment of His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to see to it that the investigation is thorough and complete, and that the truth is revealed, and that those responsible will be held to account, and that procedures and mechanisms are put in place to ensure that something like this can never happen again.
Words of reassurance. Remi, let me ask you, is that going to go over in Europe? Are they going to buy that? Is that going to stop this avalanche of criticism that we're hearing, this chorus of anger from so many leaders?
Well, obviously, the image that MBS was trying to build of a evolving Saudi Arabia with a series of small reforms that were had a lot of power and resonance in Europe, such as allowing women to drive, or allowing them to create some companies, which is some progress that have already happened in several of the neighboring countries of Qatar, of Saudi Arabia, sorry, is an image that's probably going to be shattered and for a long run. MBS, the scenario that it might be accompanied by some kind of a more senior, more veteran political figure until he actually arrives of an age of more responsibilities, but this way might be a very likely scenario, especially because MBS have done a series of errors, and as I ruffled many feathers inside the kingdom, his main policy towards Yemen has been so far a failure, although that's something that we really cannot talk about inside the kingdom. So this is going to have an impact on the policy of Saudi Arabia, and obviously on the capacity of different countries, whether European or Western, of other Western countries such as the United States, to work openly with Saudi Arabia without any kind of reform. Now, obviously, the issue here is also issue of money, and for example, President Trump has shown that in human rights, in the case of North Korea, for example, and in the case again here of Saudi Arabia, was not exactly his main focus, and he's much more concentrated on the ensuring that the American weapon and military companies are able to sell weaponry to Saudi Arabia. $3.4 billion were actually sold last year, and that's probably the main focus and the main interest of the U.S. today. And in case of European countries, it's also something that most countries trying to limit deficit will also be very keen on trying not to limit. But this will have long-standing consequences.
Yeah, well, Peter, let me ask you about that. We do hear a president who's very transactional in nature. Is the comment mechanisms are now put in place that will ensure that something like this can never happen again? Is that enough to mollify President Trump and leaders here in Washington?
I don't think so. Much of this is a kind of talk for public consumption. I would like to add, if I may, to the previous discussion on Saudi Arabia. You know, the kingdom is not a homogeneous blob. I noticed when the list of 18 was announced, only 2 were identified by name that I saw. One of them was a Brigadier General Asiri, and another one was Qahtani, I think in intelligence. And what these names reveal is that they are not from the Al Saud, they're not from the central part of the Saudi government. And Asiri means he's from a region that Saudi Arabia acquired by conquest in 1935. And he has been in charge of public affairs for the war against Yemen. And so it looks like they are branding individuals that might be expendable from the perspective of consolidating power. As one of your guests also pointed out, there are these different branches of the royal family. The so-called Sudairi 7 are back in power again, but the rest of the family is not very fond of the Sudairi 7.
Yeah, that is very much the case. So you've got that whole domestic element as well. Go ahead.
And Mike, if I may add, there's another thing that's been on my mind for a week, and that is Mr. Khashoggi did not go to Istanbul for his papers. He went to the embassy in Washington. And as usual, one has to wait several days in order to get whatever visa applications or anything else approved. And so the information was sent back to headquarters. And whoever made the decision selected Istanbul as the place to ask him to go to. And some papers have speculated that that is because his fiancée is Turkish. No, that is very superficial thinking. She was not applying for anything. They selected Istanbul in order to embarrass Turkey. As your earlier speaker commented, there is a competition going on between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And while they agree on some aspects of the Middle East, that is to say, to control somewhat Iranian influence and Shia influence, there's also competition, at least for the Sunni leadership. And in Turkey, we have a president now who's been described by many as aspiring to be the new sultan versus the custodians of the two holy shrines.
Yeah.
So this is what I see as playing out.
Yeah. And Ali, they tried to embarrass Turkey, but it looks as though it backfired. They're the ones that are embarrassed.
Well, I mean, the political murder happened in Turkey, so Turkey is very clear what needs to be done. Actually, I don't agree with the guest.
Yes, but why did they select Turkey?
Well,
Yeah,
actually, the fiancé parents requested to get the divorce paper from the consulate. I mean, I don't agree with the guest because it was very clear, and the fiancé of the journalist state that her parents wants to get the paper from the Istanbul. So I don't think there are different scenarios here. It was so clear, and because the fiancé was in Turkey.
We don't want to get too far into the weeds. I do want to talk a little bit about the Saudi monarch, the Crown Prince, meeting with the relatives of Khashoggi today, including his son. The pictures are out there. We've seen them. Kamran, you know, it's so easy to get caught up in the geopolitics of all of this, but there's a human dimension to this. You were friends with him. How difficult has this period been for you? I mean, from a surrealistic standpoint, and then to see his son there, so many people alluding to the fact that this may have been the man who ordered the execution of his father. Here he is getting condolences from him. I mean, it just, the dynamics, the optics of this, just pretty incredible, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, the son has to smile, pose for a camera, shake hands with someone who he probably holds responsible for the death of his father. And that's very difficult. I mean, what their family is going through, you know, it's unimaginable. I mean, people like myself who knew Jamal and others, I mean, there's a whole constellation of journalists in Washington and analysts who had, you know, become friends with Jamal because he was such a nice guy and he was working on a topic that a lot of people were interested in. And we feel, you know, it's really spooky. It's like too close for comfort. You know, a person that we knew got slaughtered, you know, by, you know, Saudi operatives in broad daylight in such a manner. One can only imagine the loss of the family. And, you know, looking at his son, I mean, if you notice, he's not smiling, he's not saying anything. He's kind of like stone, you know. I mean, I don't know whether he holds the government responsible, meaning the crown prince and the king responsible, but it's very difficult to shake hands. But you have to do it because, keep in mind, this isn't an open society. This is, you know, there's also some evidence to suggest that because of Jamal's opposition to the current crown prince, that his family was under pressure to disown him. And, you know, according to some reports, his wife of long standing, the mother of those children, was asked to divorce him. I mean, there was some pressure on her to disassociate herself from Jamal.
As a friend who knows him, will there be justice? Will we ever get the answers?
I don't think so, and I say that with a very heavy heart. I mean, it's one of those things that, I mean, this is the second time in my career as an analyst that I've lost a friend to these circumstances. And, you know, 2 is not really, you know, a large amount of data point where you can generalize. But, you know, the powerful get away with murder. And that's what we're trying to, that's what is happening here, partly because they want to get away with murder, but also because those who do business with them, not because they necessarily want to, but they have to, i.e. the United States, can't afford to see Saudi Arabia tank because of too much pressure. So in the end, what gets sacrificed is the sense of justice and, you know, real accountability.
We're going to leave it with the human dimension because I think that's where we should. He was a journalist who worked here in Washington, D.C. for the Washington Post, and I think when it all comes right down to it, we have to remember that. It's not the larger story, not the geopolitics. But I do want to thank all of our guests here today. It's been a great panel.